than that, I think we are ready to get started. So Katia, I'm going to let you take it over from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. So I'm happy to be here with you guys virtually today. It's great to see people from really even I'm seeing different states as well, some people from Florida. So that's really great to see. So like Ashley mentioned, my name is Katia Gonzalez. I work for a place called Alliance for Children, which is the Children's Advocacy Center here in Tarrant County. So if you're not in Tarrant County, chances are you have a Children's Advocacy Center near you guys. So it just might be called by a different name. So before we get started with this portion of the training, which is child abuse prevention, so as you see here, it's Child Abuse Prevention 101. So we're kind of going to go through a basic overview of what child abuse is and some aspects of what we can do to prevent that. So just kind of looking at y'all's introductions and what we do. So it seems like it's really relevant to y'all's work and maybe in your personal lives if you're working with foster children or just have children of your own as well. But before we get started with that portion, I know I have about an hour with you today. I just want to briefly cover who we are as Alliance for Children, if you're not familiar with us. So Alliance for Children is, again, the Children's Advocacy Center in Tarrant County. And our mission is really to serve child abuse victims in the community. So we do that in a variety of ways. We're actually the only nonprofit organization in Tarrant County that's directly involved in investigations of child abuse. And what that means is, and I'd like to use an example to explain that, back before Children's Advocacy Centers existed, say a child came to school and mentioned that they were sexually abused. So, of course, Child Protective Services would get involved. It's also a crime against a child, so law enforcement got involved. And what we realized is having all these different organizations and all these different entities is really important for the safety and justice for that child. However, we weren't necessarily working together as a team. So we were working in silos, which meant children had to be interviewed multiple times. We weren't really getting great investigative information, and it was really creating further trauma for children and families going through that investigative process. So what we have now is we have Children's Advocacy Centers. It's a nationwide model. Again, here in Tarrant County, it's Alliance for Children, and we work together as a team. So here on the screen, you'll see all of our multidisciplinary team. And it's really our goal that as a child and a family is going through this really difficult process, that first of all, we make that as easy as possible, as trauma-informed as possible, in that we provide any services that we can to where after something terrible has happened, we have the best possible outcome after that. So that looks really different in every case. So there might be some family advocacy services that we offer. We offer counseling services and just a variety of special programs to assist families that need us in that moment. Another large portion of what we do is we do work in our community to prevent child abuse. So with that, we talk to children about personal body safety, internet safety, and then we talk to people like you. We talk to adults with the hope that every adult in our community will know, number one, how to recognize that abuse might be occurring and what to do in those situations. And if a child comes and tells you something happened, that will know how to respond to that appropriately. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So that's us in a nutshell. We see children and families on a regular basis that have been victimized by child abuse. So it's a really important topic for us to discuss. And of course, I don't need to tell you, you guys probably wouldn't be here if you didn't think this training was needed, but it's just something that happens in our community on a very regular basis, and we want to make sure that we're addressing to prevent that. So if you are into statistics like I am, so this is a slide for you. If you're not, don't worry, we'll move forward with that. But just again, here in Tarrant County, we typically see about 5,000 to 6,000 confirmed victims of child abuse. So Tarrant County is number 3 in the state of Texas. So if you're not in Tarrant County, there's you can Google that and look up what your numbers are. But county by county, these numbers are fairly large to begin with. So in looking at those numbers, we can see that that's about 5,000 confirmed cases. So that means that a child made a disclosure or something was discovered, there was an investigation that occurred, and there was enough evidence to confirm that yes, abuse happened. So if you can imagine, that's probably a pretty small portion of the abuse that actually happens. We know that a lot of children don't disclose. Sometimes when they disclose, there's not any protective caregivers to make a report for us to investigate. So pretty significant numbers right here. One thing that I also want to point out before we move away from statistics is that kind of like right here, sort of in the middle, that 11% is somebody that's a stranger or an unknown person to that child. So we learned kind of a lot about, back in my day, we talked a lot about stranger danger, but we know that most of the time, the people that hurt the child are somebody that's either a known relative, somebody that's in the family, or somebody that child knows and trusts. So when we look at protective measures, we want to make sure that we're addressing that. So we want to make sure that we're, of course, keeping our children away from people that we don't trust, but having the understanding that the people that do abuse children are the people that child knows and trusts, and somebody that you as an adult that's responsible for children will also know and trust most of the time. So just creating those boundaries, regardless of who that person is really important. Okay, so let's kind of get started with talking about what child abuse is. So first, we're going to talk about some definitions of child abuse and kind of what that means, how we can recognize that abuse might be occurring. And then we'll talk about how we can prevent abuse in our communities and what to do in situations where we know that abuse has already occurred. So we'll be covering 4 types of abuse today. So with that, and just to get a little bit of engagement, so if you guys can use the chat feature, tell me, what do you think is the form of abuse? So kind of out of these 4, physical, sexual, emotional, or neglect, which forms of these abuse has the highest rate of occurrence? I'll give you guys a minute to answer. Okay, so thank you guys for your responses. I think I'm seeing everybody across the board is saying neglect. So if you think anything different, type that in. So somebody says it's physical abuse. Okay, so most of you are saying neglect, which is fantastic because you're right. Most of the time when I do trainings, people will not pick neglect, people pick something different. But you're right, so neglect is the highest form of occurrence. And it's the same every year, and it's the same in every community. So in every county, whenever we look at numbers, it tends to be the highest rate. So about 50 to 70% is from neglect. And we'll talk about why in a minute when we look at kind of different definitions of abuse. But great job on that. And then somebody answered emotional or psychological abuse, and that's actually the lowest in occurrence. However, I will venture to say, like, typically whenever we see physical abuse or neglect or sexual abuse, emotional abuse is probably a huge component of that. But looking at the definition of emotional abuse, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is just a really difficult thing for us to prove. Okay, so let's start talking about all forms of abuse. We won't start with neglect. We'll start with physical abuse. So that is, if I asked you to define physical abuse, and you don't have to put that in the chat feature because I'm sure it'll take you a while to type that up. But these are the definitions that Child Protective Services or Child Protective Investigations uses to determine if abuse has occurred. So if you guys are making a report, these are the definitions that they're looking for to determine if that's something that meets criteria for that. So physical abuse is, of course, anything that you would imagine. So it's inflicted non-accidental injury. So any kind of marks, bruises, it could be internal injuries that we can't see. And then for all forms of abuse, I also want to mention that there's that reasonable failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent this action. So it doesn't even have to be the person that's hurting the child, physically harming the child. But if there is a person that's allowing that to happen and does not make a reasonable effort to prevent that action, resulting in that child receiving an injury, then that could also be physical abuse as well. So you don't actually have to be the one that's doing the action. And looking at physical abuse, there's also something that doesn't happen by accident, which is obvious, but is also does not include reasonable discipline. So in the state of Texas, parents or caregivers have the right to physically discipline the child. It just has to be reasonable. When we're getting to the age where we're leaving marks or bruises on a child as a result of discipline, then that could very easily turn into an action of physical abuse. Okay. So let's go through some scenarios. So in this scenario, so a 6-year-old comes to daycare and has bruising, swelling to the lower back. And you guys can't see me pointing at my lower back, but the lower back, the thighs, left cheek, and then right ear. And then we're like, what happened, little Johnny? And this child said that he fell off the swing. So what do y'all think? Would you be concerned for physical abuse in that situation? And I'll let you guys answer that in the chat. And if you do think that there's concern, what are some things that are concerning in that statement or that scenario? Yeah, so all of you are saying yes. So great judgment on that. I feel comfortable with you guys being around kids. And then somebody said concerned enough to investigate further. So that's very smart. So yes, there are a lot of concerning statements with that. And you guys can kind of mention some of those. As number one is we're looking at the location of the injuries. There's swelling, multiple parts of the body. And yes, all of that. So if you're looking at this little 6-year-old, he's got injuries to the lower back and thighs. So that is a location that's difficult to get bruises accidentally. So we're automatically concerned that there might be some physical abuse with that. He's got injuries to the left cheek and the right ear. So it's different planes of the body. So that means multiple impacts. So you don't get that from one impact. And just that explanation of he fell off the swing is probably a little bit suspect. Injuries to the right ear. So injuries to the ear are also very suspect for physical abuse as well, because it's really difficult to get injuries to the ear accidentally. Okay. What about this one? So 8-year-old comes to camp with bruising and abrasions to knees, elbows, and hands. When asked, he fell off the bike. What do y'all think? Concerned for abuse? Most of you are saying that. No concerns. Yeah, so that seems pretty consistent. So if you imagine a child falling off a bike, they're probably catching themselves with their hands. So they might have abrasions there. They're falling on their knees and maybe their elbows. So it seems pretty consistent. Okay, so let's talk about, great job on that. So let's talk about some ways that we can recognize that physical abuse might be occurring. So some things that we're looking for. So number one thing we're looking for is location of injuries. So those of you that are around mobile children that are running around and playing, they probably have injuries on them on a fairly regular basis. I know my nieces do because they're active. They do like all kinds of active things, but they're usually kind of on the bony prominences of their body. So there might be injuries to like their elbows, their knees, their shins. Especially with toddlers, their heads are bigger and all the furniture is kind of close to their level. So you might see facial injuries on especially like toddler age kids when they're learning their kind of mobility. But those will be kind of on on the T-zone. So their forehead, their nose, their chin. So those are all fairly common injuries that you might see as part of just accidents that happen. So some things that we should be concerned for is if you see injuries that are just outside of that normal place. So injuries that anywhere where your organs are, so kind of your chest area, your stomach area, anywhere on your back, anything on your thighs or butt area is a lot more concerning for abuse because they're fleshy parts of the body. So it's kind of, you don't have a hard surface hitting a hard surface. So it's harder to get injuries, visible injuries as a result of that. And they're also, if you're just running around and playing, they're not typically very close areas of impact. So when we see injuries to kind of fleshy parts, back area, all of this that I mentioned already, then we're just a little bit more concerned for abuse. So I love this photo right here. It's a little bit more difficult to see, but it kind of gives you a good visual of some concerning injuries versus non-concerning injuries. Another thing that we'll look for is pattern of injuries. Now, what do I mean by pattern? Pattern could be if you're noticing a particular behavior, like maybe every time The kids are with dad for every other weekend. They come back with concerning injuries on a regular basis. It could be because dad is just more physical with them and they run around and play. But if you're seeing those kind of injuries that are like, oh, this is a little concerning. So there could be just a pattern of behavior. But really another thing that I mean by pattern is if you're noticing any kind of object on a child's body, those are typically indicative of abuse. So if you kind of see loop marks, if you see like linear marks in a row, you might be able to see a handprint. So kind of here at the bottom, there's like this perfect little handprint. I don't know if you see my little mouse looking over here. I'm not sure if you can tell. Most of the time you don't see like an exact fingerprints or handprint like that, but you'll see like little indications of that. So like maybe little dots. Bite marks, of course, if you can tell it's not a child's bite. So anything where you can see the object that the child was hit with is indicative for abuse. So it's enough information for us to make a report. And then, of course, we're getting an account. If we just have a couple of injuries and we're a little concerned, we're getting an account from the child of like, hey, little Johnny, tell me what happened. And if they say something really crazy, like they fell off a swing, when they have injuries all over their bodies and it just doesn't make sense for them to get injuries like that. So if their explanation just doesn't match, it raises that level of concern. And then we're also looking for either child's behavior. So if you have situations where kids are like wearing long sleeves, or they in the middle of summer and it's really hot, you feel like they're trying to hide their bodies or hide their injuries. If you're asking them what happened and they're really kind of cagey or like are clearly not telling you the truth. And then same with caregivers' behavior. So if you're just noticing something that's concerning where they're trying to hide something or lie to you, of course, that raises that level of concern for physical abuse. Okay. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about sentinel injuries. So far we mentioned, like I said, like it's normal for kids to have injuries, which is true if they're running around and playing, they might have those kind of injuries as a result of play. But when we're working with infants, really any kind of injury on an infant, outside of like, obviously, if there's a diaper rash or something like that, that's pretty normal for infants. But any injury on an infant is concerning. So we want to make sure that that's being addressed. And it can be any minor injury, like a little bruise, or anything like that that you see. Because kids aren't running, like infants are not mobile, they're not causing those injuries themselves. So there should be an explanation of what happened. And there could be like we had one that was a 3-year-old that threw like a humongous wood block at a kid and he got a little goose egg and it was a concerning injury, but it was an accident. So there are accidents that happen, but we have to have an explanation for that. The reason that's so important is a lot of times those minor injuries can precede severe physical abuse in infants when we're not addressing that. So for example, we had a situation where a kid started out, well, we have many examples of this, where the first case that we have, or the first time a kid went to the doctor, or like maybe went to their PCP, they had a minor bruise, not super concerning, but then maybe months later, that child ends up in the hospital. So it's something that we see on a fairly regular basis, and there's research behind that. The other reason that we really want to pay attention to that is like sometimes like those small minor bruises could also be indications that there might be internal trauma happening. We had a situation where a kiddo had like a really minor, like barely noticeable, maybe a bruise, maybe something else in the stomach, and then had like another one on the arm that the doctor noticed. And sure enough, there was all kinds of internal injury as a result of that. So that kiddo had a broken arm and had internal injuries with that. So we want to make sure that we're addressing that pretty immediately. So I did a training years and years ago, and I was talking about kind of like the concerns with infant injuries, and somebody raised their hand and said, if they ain't cruising, they ain't bruising. I was like, all right, that's very true. So if they're not moving around, they're not causing those injuries themselves. And if we see an injury, then we want to make sure that we're taking action. Okay. And then we won't spend too much time, or really any time at all, talking about internal injuries within infants, just because that could be a presentation all on its own, and we have a lot of information to cover. But just know that, especially with infants, if we have concerns for abuse, there might be internal injuries that you're not seeing anything externally, but there might be something that's internally that's happening. The most common one that we see is abusive head trauma. So most of the time, people refer to that as shaking baby syndrome. So if a kiddo has been usually it happens whenever it's a colicky baby, caregiver gets frustrated and just kind of shakes them, and it causes a lot of brain injury. So it's very common for especially young infants, especially infants that are colicky, will cry all the time, and caregivers have a hard time controlling that. Particularly if there's already a lot of other stressors in the home. So maybe it's a first-time parent, maybe there's just general stressors happening, or a caregiver that's not experienced in caring for children. So something that's important for us to address. Okay, so before we move on to other forms of abuse, does anybody have any questions that you'd like to put in the chat? You're welcome to do that. In particular, what we talked about. In fact, let's just make it a rule for the rest of the training. Instead of me pausing to ask for questions, if you at any point have any kind of questions as I'm talking, feel free just to use the chat feature or even the questions and answer feature, and I'll try to pay attention to that. I'm looking at it on the screen right here, so I will pay attention to that and answer that. Okay, thank you for the thumbs up. All right, so that covers physical abuse. So let's talk about neglect, which was, again, the highest form of abuse we typically see. And here's all of the forms of neglect that you might see with the kiddo. So neglect is essentially blatant disregard for or actions that put a child in harm, so results in some sort of harm or immediate danger. It used to be the definition was risk of substantial harm, but now it's changed over the years to where our actions are resulting in harm of the child or placing a child in immediate danger for their health. And there's a variety of components of that. So neglectful supervision is essentially leaving a child in a dangerous situation. So that could be if a caregiver is using drugs or alcohol, and a child does not have the capacity to care by themselves. So that's putting them in danger. Physical neglect is not providing, of course, for the basic needs of a child. Medical neglect is not providing for medical needs of the child. And then abandonment and refusal to accept parental responsibilities, or RAPR, sound very similar, has slight different variations. So abandonment is whenever you just leave a child and never come back. So imagine a kiddo like left at a gas station and parents don't come back to pick them up, or just left at an aunt's house with no intention to come back. And then refusal to accept parental responsibility is oftentimes like a intentional, all right, I can't take care of my child anymore. Like maybe they have mental health issues I can't handle, or they're just have behavioral issues I can't handle. So I'm placing that child in the custody of Child Protective Services, or DFPS. So it's essentially saying, this is your responsibility now, not mine. So a lot of times we see those with teenagers that have a lot of behavioral issues that parents just don't have the ability to handle anymore. So that kind of covers some of that. So you can kind of see, just based on that definition, why that might be a pretty high occurrence of neglect that happens in our community. Okay, so to solidify our understanding of that, let's go through some scenarios. So if you guys can be ready to start typing. So let's say here's our first scenario. It's 40 degrees outside. Child comes to daycare without a coat, and then parents are just struggling financially and can't really provide proper clothing for their child. So what do we think about that? Is that neglect or not neglect? Okay, so most of you are saying no, and you'd probably be right. So number one, we're looking at, like, is there harm to that child? So if they're going to be outside in 40-degree weather, depending on their age, that could be pretty dangerous. Yes. We don't really know that based on that statement, but it's also a good indication that poverty is not neglect. So it's not abuse or neglect. So it's just providing them with resources to make sure that they have that basic need met. Okay, so what about child has diabetes? requires insulin, and then caregiver just seems unconcerned about administering that medication. Would that be neglect or not? Yep. All right, somebody's very strong. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that would be neglect, particularly with that statement, they're just not concerned. So it's not that they can't afford insulin or just struggling, as the caregiver just keeps forgetting to administer that. The other aspect of that is that certainly results in immediate danger to that child if that medication is not provided. Okay, let me go back. Family is homeless, living in a car without AC. So those of us that are in Texas, we know that Texas weather gets really hot in the summer. So the weather is supposed to be about 110 degrees. Family doesn't have anywhere else to go. What do we think about that? Yeah, so most of you that responded are saying yes, that's neglect. And again, there is that distinction between poverty and like true neglect, where a caregiver is just failing to provide that care. Number one is that like it's a dangerous situation, so we have to make sure that we're taking action. So you're looking at kind of at the danger aspect of that. Is there harm to the child? Is there immediate danger to the child? So in that scenario, it's yes, right? That could be really dangerous. And in that circumstance, if parents are doing their best, if there's something that we can do to provide those resources, that's the first course of action. So it's not necessarily that you're saying like these are bad parents that are not providing for their child, but you're addressing that immediate danger of the child. So if I was a CPS worker or CPI worker and I received this case, my first priority would be to find resources for that family to make sure that they're able to care for their child. And then somebody said, no, you can open windows. So again, you're right. It's kind of depending on the situation. If there's a way to make sure that that child is safe, that's great. But probably still not a best case scenario for the safety of that child. And then this should be an easy one. Dad comes to pick up a child from camp, is clearly under the influence of narcotics. So neglect or not neglect? Yeah, absolutely. So that's neglect. And in this situation, kind of if you're thinking about how we're going to respond to that, so if you're that childcare provider and this dad is intoxicated about to drive with that child, that's an immediate action, right? So we want to make sure that we're addressing that immediately. So it's probably not a time to call a CPS because they will take, or CPI or DFPS, however you want to refer to that, because they're going to take a while to respond. So in that circumstance where this guy is about to be driving with a child while intoxicated, we want to call 911 and kind of get that immediate response. Okay. And then lastly, just to cover kind of how we can recognize neglect, we talked about kind of just looking through the definition and determining like, is this child in danger or is there harm to that child would be a good kind of marker for us to look through. But some ways that we can recognize that if you're noticing that a child is not gaining weight properly or losing weight, and it's a result of them not getting their proper food and nutrition, and especially if that's accompanied by a child that's begging for food or hoarding food or stealing that because you clearly know that they're not getting that in their environment. If there's severe poor hygiene. So I want to also distinguish that there is a difference between something that rises to the level of harm and danger versus this is not how I would parent my child, right? So maybe a kid is a little bit smelly, like maybe they're like, don't do laundry on a regular basis. And if that's it, then there's not any harm associated with that. Now, if a child is really smelly, parents don't do laundry, and there's like feces in the home and they have bug bites, then you can kind of see how that rises to the level of substantial harm to that child. So kind of gauging it on that. Like if a child smells like marijuana, so you know that they're exposed to drug use in the home, things like that would rise to that level of harm. Of course, not getting basic needs met or medical needs, drug use by caregivers, especially when children are present or young enough to where they can't care for themselves, is a concern. Domestic violence. So if caregivers are engaging in violence in presence of the child or even with a child in the home, but they're still exposed to that, that's a concern. And then just any kind of general interactions that you see between a child and caregiver that indicates that that child might be in some sort of danger. Okay. We have two more forms of abuse to get through before we kind of start talking about prevention methods. And I know I'm going fairly quickly, but just based on your professions of what I'm seeing on the screen, it seems like this might just be a great review for everyone. So emotional abuse. So far, what we've talked about in forms of abuse is a lot of like physical abuse and neglect. It's easy to see. So you'll see injuries on kids. You'll see indications that abuse is occurring. And then emotional abuse is a little bit hard for us to identify. So I'm going to read you guys the definition, or you can see it on the screen exactly. So mental or emotional injury to a child that results in, I want to point out, that observable and material impairment in the child's growth, development, and functioning. So it's kind of looking at that observable and material impairment is what we have to prove. So because of the actions of this caregiver, that results and directly results in that child being suicidal, or that child's grades dropping, or whatever that child's impairment is as a direct result of the caregiver's actions with that child. Sometimes it's called verbal abuse, psychological abuse. That's all kind of in that same umbrella of emotional abuse. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's probably a huge component of any abuse that a child experiences. But in order to prove that, to show that observable and material impairment, it's a difficult thing for us to prove. So if you're curious about just kind of statistics, so in Tarrant County, in your county, if you're not with us, might be a little bit different, but in Tarrant County, we just had 31 confirmed cases of emotional abuse for the entire year, so the entire of 2022. So not a whole lot, but I know it happens a lot more. Okay, so sexual abuse, again, fairly easy for us to define. So any kind of sexual act with a child is essentially sexual abuse. And it doesn't have to be physical contact. So it could be showing a child pornography, taking sexual abuse material of a child and showing it to others. So it doesn't have to be necessarily physical contact with a kid. So exposing a child to something, showing them inappropriate materials. And again, that failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent that. So in my years of working in the child abuse field, when I've seen that kind of failure to make reasonable effort to prevent, whenever it like goes against the person that we're saying like you're responsible for that abuse, most of the time it's with sexual abuse. Whenever there's a participant or a caregiver that's willingly allowing that to happen, we see that with sexual abuse a lot. Okay. So far I've talked about how we can recognize signs that abuse might be occurring. And with sexual abuse, there's not typically any kind of physical signs that abuse has happened. Most of the times we see a lot of behavioral signs. And let me take a pause to answer questions. So kind of that comment of like emotional abuse has such a high standard than other types of abuses, have to show that impairment. Only one that has that standard. So I think if I'm understanding, so is emotional abuse the only one that has that standard of showing an impairment? And really all forms of abuse have some sort of like showing that abuse has happened. So with physical abuse, it's showing injuries, like that child is injured. So that's a clearer way for us to indicate that abuse has happened. With neglect, there's also some physical indications or kind of like some behavioral things that we see that a child might be in danger. With emotional abuse, it's just a hard one. But there does have to be something to show that emotional abuse has happened, some sort of impairment to that child. So hopefully I answered your question, but if you need a clarification, I certainly can do that. So kind of that's the same thing with sexual abuse. There's not going to be any kind of physical indications typically that sexual abuse has happened. So what the child tells us and kind of some of the corroborating evidence surrounding that is really important for us to prove that sexual abuse has occurred, and easy to do if we do that appropriately. But for you guys that are not doing investigations, so hopefully none of you guys are in that form of doing investigations if you're just serving kids in a different capacity. But what you'll see is a lot of behavioral indications that trauma has happened. And here is a list of some indications that abuse has happened. It's a very short list and it's not a comprehensive one. So what I would really recommend is looking at what's normal for a particular child that you're working with or live with, that's your own kiddo. And if you see a drastic change in that normal, then it's something to address. Doesn't necessarily mean that, hey, this child has been sexualized or has been sexually abused, but something is going on that we want to ask questions in an appropriate way, and make sure that we're addressing that. Okay. I see a comment here, so let me take a time to address that. Sorry, it's taking me a while to look. I don't know, Ashley, if you're on this, if you don't mind kind of handling that comment with Terry, like it won't let me go through the screen, so I can't read it all. So there's a way that you can address that and let me know if there's something I can answer. It's not letting me look at it.
Yes, I'll read through it and check on that.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for that question. So hopefully we'll answer that in a minute when somebody can read it. But I'm going to go ahead and keep talking about sexual abuse. So kind of behavioral indications is something that we might see. Another thing I want to point out is recognizing grooming dynamics, and then providing opportunities for disclosure, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the reason kind of I have some of these kind of destructive behaviors and anger, hostility, is because a lot of the times we see these behaviors and we might be like, well, this is just a bad kid, or they're just being disrespectful or disobedient. So just taking the time to ask yourself, is this just a kid that's having bad behaviors, or is this a coping mechanism that a kid has developed in order to deal with some trauma that happens? So if we kind of shift our thinking with the child's behavior, to look at like what's the cause behind that, then we might be able to catch some of those signs of abuse that aren't readily seen on their bodies.
I'll read this question for you, Katia, real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I have a single mom of 4 teens. 2 are my clients, who said mom got upset and took a bat to break their TVs recently after coming home from working after long hours and chores were not done. This has been a weekly occurrence of the teens for the past year, with frequent yelling and blaming between them. The electronics were paid for by dad, divorced, out of state, and she told him what happened. Is this manipulation or intimidation?
I think it's certainly very concerning, and probably enough for us to make a report, just based on the fact that I believe it says it's a weekly occurrence, something that happens a lot. And it's always like blaming this child for like, sounds like just normal teenage behavior, like chores not getting done, like what teenager does their chores on a regular basis. So just because the fact that it's like, sounds like normal behavior that's getting severely punished happens on a regular basis, like I think it's enough for us to go ahead and make a report. So investigators, like if they meets their criteria, can come out and investigate and question further. Especially if you kind of if we're looking at the dynamics of like, how is that impacting the child? Like, are their grades dropping? Is there something that's emotionally happening to them as a result of that treatment?
Perfect. And then she said, apparently they're often using technology instead of helping her out. Kids are blaming each other for not doing the chores. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So certainly concerning. You're right. Okay. Thank you for that question. Okay. So I mentioned kind of some of, back to sexual abuse, I mentioned some of indications that we might see is grooming. So here, grooming is essentially how sexual abuse occurs. So typically it doesn't happen when somebody just walks into the room and starts abusing a child. There's a long kind of manipulative process associated with that. And here on the screen, you'll see some examples, but it might look different for every child. How long it takes might look different. And there certainly have been circumstances where a child immediately gets victimized and that grooming process is super, super fast. So I don't want you to dismiss a child's sexual abuse outcry if you don't see those grooming dynamics, because sometimes it's either difficult to see, or this person is so confident that they'll be able to abuse a child that you don't see that grooming dynamic. But rather than me talking, let me try to let's watch this video. So just a disclaimer, this is, she's an adult now, but she was victimized as a child, and kind of talks through some of those grooming experiences. So if that might be difficult for you to watch, feel free to mute and come back to us in about 2 minutes. It's about a 2-minute video.
Well, her drama teacher, Mr. Wilson, abused his position, grooming her for 2 years before making her believe that they were in love.
Well, now, 20 years after her ordeal, the former teacher has been jailed, and Hayley waived her right to anonymity in the hope that it will help others. And she joins us now. And welcome to you. Very brave for being here talking about this today. Let's go back to when you were this 12-year-old schoolgirl. You're very sporty. You were good at school, didn't really get much attention from the boys. To be honest, nothing you were really interested in anyway. It was a bit too early for all of that. But along comes this teacher, this drama teacher, Mr. Wilson. He's 25. And you say that you weren't the only girl to have a crush on him. There was something about him. So what was it?
It was like this. We went from your old school teachers and your tweed and, you know, and all of a sudden we got this new influx of good-looking young teachers, and he was new. He was in a band. He was also a performer, and I wanted to be. I was a little dancer. I wanted to be a performer, and so it was in awe of what he was doing, as well as kind of everyone was like, "Oh, have you seen him? Have you seen him?"
Yeah.
And
The boys thought he was cool.
Yeah, he just and he would just be down with the kids, I suppose, for want of a
And how
better
did he
phrase.
boost your confidence? Because you didn't have high confidence at that time.
I
did you?
know. I was like any other young girl starting at senior school. You know, boys used to pick on me. I had quite bad skin, and he just used to always mention my lovely blonde hair, how I've got sparkly blue eyes, I've got a beautiful smile. So I was getting all this attention from him and no one my own age.
He was quite clever because he befriended your dad.
Yeah.
They had a love of a football team.
Yeah.
So they'd go to the football together.
Yeah.
What did your dad think of him?
Back then, thought he was just a nice guy that had his daughter's best interest at heart.
He was married, he had kids.
Married, yeah, a special needs child. He was a family man. You know, mum and the wife got on. It was a picture perfect family on the surface.
Well, he
so they
put
got on.
you in the lead of 3 of the school plays, and you were beginning to feel really good about yourself.
Yeah.
And so when did it, looking back at it now, when did it turn sinister?
It's looking back at it now that I realise it was all quite sinister. I think at the time, even it wasn't, you know, but he dropped me off after a rehearsal of one of the school plays because it had finished late. I've got a brother who's 9 years younger than me, so, you know, my parents were having to look after him as well. So he...
Well, her drama teacher...
Kind of stops it right there. But hopefully you guys can kind of see some of those grooming dynamics of this person befriended the family, so became a trusted member in that family that the family trusted, picked a vulnerable kid that had a brother with disabilities, so parents were kind of busy with him, had a lot of isolated contact of like, hey, I'll pick you up from school and we'll stay late. And then I don't think she mentioned it here, but it was a gradual breaking of physical boundaries. So it started with like a touch to the knee, then a touch on the shoulder, then long hugs, sitting on laps, and I just progressed and progressed and progressed. And to this kiddo, she knew that that was wrong, but to this kiddo, like this was a person that loved her. This is a person that she thought was was her boyfriend, and she was devastated whenever he moved. So even those so can you imagine kind of the trying to think of the right word for that. So like to that person, this wasn't abuse, and it took her a while to recognize that. But for a lot of these kids, like we know that the actions we see, like this isn't something they want happening, but this is a loved one. And like in the midst of them being sexually abused, like this is the person that also cares about them and buys them an ice cream and is that support system for them. So we see a lot of those dynamics, which makes it really hard for kids to disclose that something is happening. And we'll talk about kind of how to encourage disclosure in a little bit. But one of the best protective measures as far as making sure that kids are safe from sexual abuse, and as much as we can control that, is having conversations with kids about personal body safety. And there's lots and lots of resources out there. Again, that could be like an hour conversation just talking about this topic. But as a quick overview, we really want to make sure that we're teaching kids what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So what's okay and what's not okay, using very age-appropriate language. So we want to make sure that we empower them, that even if it's an adult or an authority figure, we have the right to say no and kind of get away from that situation. and the importance of talking to a trusted adult. Again, I know I'm doing a very basic overview of this, just in the interest of time, but there's also tons of resources. So these are some children's books that we really recommend that kind of cover, like these middle ones cover the basics of this is okay, this is not okay, these are what private parts are, kind of teaching the aspects of them. That kind of on the side, some secrets shouldn't be kept, goes through some of those grooming dynamics, which we want to discuss with kids in a, again, age appropriate way of teaching them, like, if anybody tells you to keep secrets, this is what you should do. If somebody threatens you, going through some of those basics. And then that very first one, I Said No, is actually one of my favorite books. But again, it kind of teaches kids planning for those red flags. So if you notice a red flag, if you're in an unsafe situation, if somebody's making you feel uncomfortable or making you do something you don't want to do, what do you actually do in that circumstance? Because sometimes I think kids know that this isn't okay, but oh gosh, what do I do? Like, who do I tell? Can I even tell? So kind of safety planning those aspects and preparing kids to know what to do in those situations is important. So again, some books as resources. Our website, if you go to our website, has lots of resources as well. That are some videos and such that you can watch with kids and then get resources for parents as well. Okay. And then some other important aspects of preventing abuse. So like if we just ended the training here and said, this is how abuse happens, that would be pretty depressing. But luckily there are some things that we can do to prevent that. So each situation is a little bit different. So based on if you're protecting kids in your family versus protecting kids in a youth serving setting. But some basic things that we want to look through is addressing vulnerabilities. So there might be victim vulnerabilities, kind of like what does the physical environment look like, any situational vulnerabilities. So looking at like what makes a child vulnerable for abuse, and then what do we do to address those vulnerabilities? So if it's a kiddo that's not verbal, isn't able to tell us if somebody's hurting them, then that's probably a circumstance where we want to make sure that that child is not alone with an adult because they can't tell you if something is happening. Even if they can, we still want to make sure that we're kind of avoiding isolated contacts with adults. So kind of creating a physical environment. So if you're in a youth serving organization, are there vulnerabilities in just the physical environment? Like where are the restrooms? So if the restrooms are clear across the hall, are we going to allow an adult and a child to be in a restroom alone together? Or are we going to go like allow kids to be in the restrooms together? Because we know that juveniles also offend children. So kind of, or how can we make sure like if there's any kind of vulnerabilities in that physical environment, how do we make sure that we address that? And then same with situational. So I like to use gymnastics as a good example of a situational vulnerability, because as part of that sport, there's a lot of physical contact between the coach and the student, right? So they're teaching them how to do flips and things like that. So they're touching them kind of like all over their bodies to teach them how to do that. So that's a situation where we want to make sure that everything is very observable and very out in the open to make sure that there's not anything that's inappropriate happening. So in a youth serving organization, that should be an easy one for us to address because there should be policies in place that everybody's following and to make sure that there's not any isolated one-on-one contact. Make sure if there does need to be maybe a private conversation to address a behavior or something like that, make sure that it's very observed to where we're not having a conversation with a kiddo in a room by themselves, but maybe in a hallway where everybody walking by can't hear but can see what's happening, right? So kind of in making sure that adults in the room are properly trained how to recognize if they see grooming dynamics or if they see something that's shouldn't be happening. And I will say probably, and yes, Ms. Helms, we can certainly email those to you. Yeah. And I will say probably, especially in a group with you guys, it seems like most of you on the screen or on the this Zoom are professionals. When we see abuse that happens with people that are already educated, they know what abuse is, they know how to prevent it. When we still see kind of things go off the rails, it's because we've gotten complacent in that. Because most of the time people that abuse kids are somebody that you would never imagine would abuse a child or somebody that you really trust. When we see those red flags, when we're seeing boundary violations, it's very easy to dismiss that as like, oh, he's just touchy-feely, or like, there's no way somebody like that could do that. So my encouragement to you guys, whenever we're talking about prevention of abuse, is if you see a red flag, treat it as a red flag, regardless of who that person is. So if there's something that's kind of an up-oh feeling, or like just something that makes you feel uncomfortable, act on it. And then, like, again, doesn't mean that you have to like accuse that person and or like throw them in jail or something like that, but act on it somehow, and not dismiss it as, well, like, this is somebody that I know. I'd never imagine they would do something like that. Because that's typically how we see abuse happening, is we become complacent and ignore the red flags before abuse actually happens. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about disclosures of abuse. So we'll watch one last video for the day to give you guys a little bit of a break from listening to me talk today.
Hey, it's Talk Tuesday. My name's Trista. I just wanted to talk to you for a second about the disclosure process. Did you know that how a kid tells about their abuse is different for every kid? There is no right or wrong way that a kid may disclose sexual abuse. And in that, it starts with the denial phase. The denial phase of disclosure is going to be when a kid is not ready to talk about it. Over 50% of our kiddos here in Tarrant County start in the denial phase of disclosure. Next, there's a tentative phase of disclosure. That's going to be when a kiddo is talking just about the tip of the iceberg. They really are seeing how everyone is reacting to that information they're sharing. Then there's the active phase of disclosure. That's when someone is actively seeking help, talking about their experience and what happened. Then we move into the recantation phase of disclosure. That's going to be when a child or adult takes back their original statement. And that happens for a number of reasons. That can happen because of family pressures, financial concerns for that kiddo. Maybe it didn't happen. Lots of different things that are taken into consideration there. Then there's the reaffirmation stage of disclosure. And that is when an individual later reaffirms the original statement that was made. They say over 70% of individuals later reaffirm the initial statement made. So just know that no kid or person tells their story the same way, and that throughout that phase of disclosure, there's no restrictions on how they move through that. It could start off in tentative phase, move to active phase, and then that's where they stay. Or it could go from denial to active to recantation to reaffirmation. We really don't know. But if a kid or adult reports to you sexual abuse, stop and call the authorities.
Trista is one of our forensic interviewers, so she really used a pretty scientific approach to how disclosures of abuse happen. And the important, because she's a forensic interviewer and that's what she does. But the important thing for us to remember is just kind of how we can encourage those disclosures, and remembering the fact that it looks different from every kid. So some children might tell us right away that something happened, but if they take years or months to do that, that's pretty normal as well. And then some kids might tell us that something happened, but then gosh, like this guy is now in jail and she loves this person, and like maybe mom is now struggling financially or doesn't believe her, then it's also pretty normal for a kid to say, never mind, it didn't happen. And it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just there's a lot of dynamics at play with that. And we know that most children don't disclose abuse. They're not in that active phase of disclosure right away after the abuse has happened. And we talk a lot about why children don't feel comfortable disclosing abuse. But for the purposes of today, I think it's probably a little bit more helpful for us to talk about what we can do to encourage those disclosures. So how can we help a child tell us? So most of the time, so for younger kiddos, it might just be like, they don't even know this is abuse and they're just telling you about their weekend. So it might be easier for them to tell. But a lot of times for kids that kind of have that weighing the benefits versus the costs of telling. So they might have this kind of internal conflict, and eventually there's some sort of trigger that's like, all right, this is time to tell. So before it wasn't worth it. It's like there's a lot of dynamics happening, but now I'm ready to tell. So at a certain point, there might be some sort of trigger. It might be that the perpetrator is out of the home. They might be concerned about siblings that might be abused. Or it might be because their cell phone got taken away, and now they're like, you're already abusing me and now you're taking away my cell phone. So that's the moment that they decide to tell. So don't judge people's triggers and why they decide to tell. It could be trivial to us, but it's not to that child. So once a child makes the decision to tell, it's important that they have, I don't know if y'all can see my little mouse here. It's important that they have a trusted adult that they can talk to. So that could be any of you if you have access to kids, right? But outside of having a trusted adult that they can talk to, it's also creating those opportunities for a child to actually make a disclosure. So if we're in a school setting, for example, and Miss Smith is my favorite teacher and she loves me, and I know that she cares about me, so she's my trusted adult. But if Miss Smith is so busy to where I'm trying to tell her about my weekend and she's clearly disengaged and not paying attention, then I'm not going to make a disclosure of abuse because she's not even paying attention to about my weekend or like the picture I drew. So it's kind of that importance of paying attention to kids, making eye contact, especially if we have concerns for kiddos, that we're creating those opportunities to where if a child did need to talk to us, they know we're listening, they know we're paying attention, and we're creating those opportunities where a kid has the actual opportunity to talk to us about what happened. Okay. And then once a child discloses, we want to make sure that we're remaining as calm as possible to kind of allow that child to feel comfortable talking to us. Where if there's clear indication where that child is clearly telling you that sexual abuse has happened or any abuse has happened, there's not any need to ask any more questions. But if a disclosure is concerning, so they might say oh, grandpa makes me feel really uncomfortable. Then you can ask very open-ended questions tell me more about that. How does grandpa make you feel uncomfortable? To where you're not putting words in a child's mouth. So making sure it's very open-ended question. And that phrase, tell me more, is a really good one to use if you're not sure if what they're telling you is about abuse. And if they're kind of tentative and take a while to talk about it, just let that happen. So don't pressure that child to say more. Don't get impatient with them. So just stay with them in that moment and allow them as long as they need to tell you if there's anything that they need to tell. And then if they're unsure, you can revert to a safe subject if they're getting really nervous, and then come back to that, hey, you were telling me about grandpa making you feel uncomfortable. Tell me more about that. And then of course we know to make a report afterwards. Those of you that are in organizational settings, so a lot of times we have well, I'll have that child make a statement, or they just told me, I'll have them go tell a counselor, which seems like a really helpful thing for us to do in the moment, but that's also not necessary. So just keep in mind, we want to eliminate or reduce the amount of times a child has to talk about their trauma. So that's why we're not asking very detailed questions. We're not interrogating that child or investigating that situation. We're just confirming abuse happens. Then we're not asking any more questions once that's confirmed, and then we're making a report, because the next step will be for that child to have a forensic interview potentially, and then all kinds of questions will be asked, and that's in a very appropriate manner after that. So we want to minimize the amount of times children have to make those disclosures. And of course, you guys can kind of read on the what not to do in situations don't notify the perpetrator, investigate your case, all of that. And then once a child makes a disclosure to us, whether we believe that child or not, whether we agree with what happens, if a child ever makes a disclosure to us, or if we suspect that abuse is happening, we're all mandated reporters in the state of Texas. So if you're an adult, you're a mandated reporter, regardless of your profession. If you do have a professional, if you're a professional, you just have a greater responsibility to make that report. So anytime you witness abuse, oops, I'm going too fast. Child discloses something to you, or if you just have concerns for the safety of a child. Again, here in the state of Texas, so if you're not from Texas, you might Google how to make a report, but in the state of Texas, there's a 1-800 number that you call, or you can use the texasabusehotline.org for non-emergencies. And then if there's an extreme emergency, where you need somebody right now, then probably calling law enforcement would be your best bet. So that's how we make reports regarding abuse that happens. Okay. And then you can make a report anonymous. So you can just say, I wish to remain anonymous. We don't recommend that because there's not enough gravity to anonymous cases. But just know that if you do provide your information is still confidential. So nobody's going to say, so-and-so made a report about you. Your information stays very confidential. At the end, you don't get to know the outcome of the report of what happened in that investigation, because just like your information is confidential, that family's information is confidential as well. Okay, so we are at the end of our time, so I will end it here. Let me